Cases of the avian or bird flu continue to be seen across our country, with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency now confirming cases of the H5N1 strain detected in southern Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and Saskatchewan recently. Now, the sudden rise in cases raising concerns, especially among poultry farmers. But how much of a threat does this pose to the public? Joining us now with more on this is Dr. Brian Stevens. He's a wildlife pathologist for the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, the Ontario Nunavut region. Doctor, we appreciate this. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get into the numbers here. I mean, they are pretty grim right now. More than, 160,000 killed or euthanized in Alberta, more than 84,000 in Ontario. So the numbers continue to grow across this country. Before we get into the general impact in this country and especially for poultry farmers, do we have a sense of where this came from, the origin?
So bird flu is something that's very common in wild birds. We see different strains every year, similar to what we see in human flu viruses, where we'll see new strains show up every season. So this strain showed up in Europe approximately last year sometime, and its normal migratory pathway of the wild birds brought it to North America in approximately December of 2021. And this strain in particular is a little bit different. As you mentioned, it will cause high deaths and mortality in commercial poultry, chickens and turkeys, but it's also affecting wild birds, which is a little bit unusual.
So it's really not a matter of if, it's when and how bad. I mean, compared to previous years, would this rate among the top?
Yeah, so this is definitely a severe outbreak. As I mentioned, when we see this in North America, poultry farmers are definitely the ones who get hit the hardest by this. They definitely have a high mortality rate in these commercial operations. But the main difference with this one is the wildlife that's being affected. Typically, it doesn't cause disease in wildlife. A lot of these birds will live with the flu and just get very mild disease or not show any signs. But this one, they're actually showing clinical signs, and many wild birds are actually dying from this as well.
So the transmission between birds, what about to humans?
So it's extremely rare, luckily. There have only been a handful of cases across the world and none in North America that I'm aware of, but it doesn't appear to be a major threat to people at this point.
What about the animals themselves in terms of the impact on poultry farms? What are we seeing right now?
So poultry farms, it's definitely affecting them. So if you get a case in a poultry farm, then the CFIA will be called out. And unfortunately, all of the birds on that site will have to be euthanized. And then they set up control zones around there. So it can be quite devastating to the industry.
Given all of that, given the risk to humans is quite low, can these animals and even the eggs, can they still be consumed or no?
Yeah, so the good thing with this virus is that it is killed by heat. So as long as people are cooking meat appropriately and cooking eggs appropriately, then there shouldn't be a concern for it to be transferred to people. And that's not as big a concern when we're talking about poultry, because as I mentioned, if a poultry farm were to develop this disease, then those animals would not enter the food chain. But when it comes to hunters who are hunting ducks and geese, there's always a concern about whether or not hunters could pick this up, because it could be in a wild bird without them showing any symptoms. But the good news is that as long as the meat is appropriately cooked, then there's no concern for people to get it.
So let's talk about the symptoms. I mean, this might be obvious for a lot of farmers who perhaps are watching, but what should they be looking out for?
So in poultry, it could be anything from respiratory disease, so coughing, sneezing, anything like that. They'll get discoloration of the wattles and along their skin at times, and then sometimes neurological signs. And that's actually what we've seen in the wildlife is neurological signs. So a lot of these birds are having trouble standing, can't fly appropriately. People will approach them and they're not moving away, and they have these erratic head and neck movements.
In terms of trying to, I guess, prevent this from getting out of control, is one of the best advice is try to keep the animals inside? Is that one of the tools that we have?
Yeah, for any poultry farmer, whether it's a big commercial flock or small flock, the best thing to do is to increase biosecurity. So that often is keeping the birds inside, away from any contact with wild birds. And if you can, just trying to have specific clothing that is only in the coop, and not bring anything from outside inside to the coop.
All right. Well, we appreciate this. I mean, a lot of people are certainly alarmed by this news, but this really puts it in perspective. We appreciate your time and your insight. That's Dr. Brian Stevens, wildlife pathologist with the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.